Welcome to this video lecture, Understanding Project Management, a Practical Guide, Chapter 9, Risk Planning. Okay, we are continuing in the project lifecycle, and we are today talking about the risk planning part of the planning phase. Our agenda, there's two questions that we're going to answer. What can go wrong during the project, and how can risks be managed? Now, for what can go wrong during the project, the first step is to consider everything that could possibly go wrong during the project. These risks through discussions with various stakeholders, review of the project scope, and research into previous projects. This should be a group effort where more minds are better than one. The project team should be involved. Key stakeholders should be involved. The idea is to identify as many different possible risks, things that could possibly go wrong in the future, as possible. Each risk identified should then be assessed as follows. How likely is it that this risk will occur? And if it does occur, what will be the impact on the project? Those are the two different factors that should be considered in order to be able to analyze and properly prioritize the risk. So when describing the probability and impact, they may be done in one of two ways. They can be done qualitatively, that is, to define the qualities of them. For example, high, medium, or low. The probability could be described as that. And the impact could be described as that. Or they may be described quantitatively. That is, for example, the probability could be quantified to be 10%, or the impact could be quantified to be, say, $10,000. Now, both of the approaches have pros and cons. The qualitative approach is arguably, or is simpler to do, is high, medium, low, and so on. That's the good part. The downside is that it's sometimes difficult to distinguish, well, what's high and what's medium, and a lot of times it converges to medium. So we end up with a lot of medium risks. The quantitative approach, the advantage is that it's very precise, that 10% and 20%, we really understand what the difference between those are. The downside is it's difficult to do. A lot of times teams will be hesitant to define whether it's 10%. It's almost too precise for the process, or trying to assign a dollar impact is very difficult to do. So the difficulty in coming up with a number prevents sometimes some commitment in terms of what it should be. This course combines the qualitative and quantitative approaches as follows, and we'll show the methodology. Now, this is not to suggest this is the only methodology that is used. This is one of many that could be used. But here's how we're going to look at it. One is with regard to probability. We're going to say that, okay, there are three different possibilities, some qualitative possibilities, that the probability of the risk occurring is either likely, possible, or unlikely. And there is wording around that. If you check the textbook, you'll see the wording around what likely, possible, and unlikely mean. When we're assessing a risk, if we choose likely, we will assign a probability factor of 0.8. Possible 0.5, and unlikely 0.2. Now, key to note here, this is not the probability of it. It's not the percentage. So likely doesn't mean it's 80%, and unlikely is not 20%. It is merely a number that is being assigned. That likely is greater than possible, which is greater than unlikely. Likewise, on the impact, we have four different selections of how we can describe the impact as either being critical, severe, moderate, or low. And again, if you look at the textbook, you'll see wording as to what each of those would mean if we were trying to assess. And then when we choose one of the impacts, the impact factor is assigned. For example, if we were to choose critical, the impact factor would be 10. Moderate, it would be 5, and so on. And then what we can do, now that we have converted the probability and impact into a factor, a number, we can create a risk score by calculating or the probability factor multiplied by the impact factor. So for example, if we had a likely probability that was a severe impact, that would be 0.8 times 8, which would be 6.4. Or if we had a possible probability for a moderate impact, it would be 0.5 times 5, which equals 2.5. So we can calculate the risk score, with the idea being the higher the risk score, the more damaging the risk can potentially be. High risk scores are damaging, low risk scores are less so. And that allows us to prioritize. Let's watch our first video in this section about identifying and analyzing project risks.
Sophie has gathered her project team together to plan for possible risks. The project's remote team member, Chris, is also attending the meeting through video conferencing. Sophie calls the meeting to order.
I've called the meeting today so that we as a team can plan for what could go wrong during the DecoCam version 4 product launch project. We've had a lot of problems on other projects recently. I think if we put some additional focus on risk management, we can reduce the number of problems for this project.
Fatijit, the team's business analyst, leans forward in his chair.
I hear you, Sophie, but many things that have happened in the past were outside of our control. What could we do about it anyway?
Fair enough, Fatijit. But even for these issues, it would be useful for us to have a backup plan. And I bet there are many potential problems that are well within our control. We want to prevent them from ever happening.
Sophie then hands out a few blank cards to each team member and asks Chris to take out a few blank cards in his office. She asks each person to write down as many potential problems as they can. While the team may be tempted to eliminate ideas, it is best to allow for an open flow of ideas and not filter anything at this point. Within a few minutes, completed cards are scattered across the table. Sophie writes each risk on the whiteboard. Sophie and the project team proceed to discuss and plan for each risk in detail. This includes creating a longer description of each risk as well as selecting the probability factor and impact factor of each risk. They calculate the risk score for each risk and put these in order from the highest score to the lowest.
So during this video, the project team identifies as many risks as possible. And this is an important step. This is not the time to be, filtering down and saying that this risk couldn't possibly happen. Oftentimes, it's the risk that you don't think will happen is the one that actually ends up occurring. Using the probability and impact tables, a probability factor and a risk factor is determining, resulting in a risk score for each risk. The information is placed in the risk register. And you can see this risk register for the case study in the textbook, Chapter 9. Key idea, identify and analyze the project risks according to their probability and impact. Now, the next is, how can the risks be managed? And this is what we're trying to get to. We're not happy with just having a list of risks that will just be something we worry about. We need to now do something about it. So in order to address these risks, and what we want to do is we know their potential. We know the priority of them. We know which ones have the highest risk scores. Certain actions may be taken. These are called risk response strategies. There are 5 different risk response strategies, and you can find these within the textbook. In summary, though, they are, for example, one risk response strategy is accept, where we look at it and say, that's something that we are not going to take any action for. If it happens, it happens. Generally, those are we take this, or we use this risk response strategy for very low risk scores, those that tend to be low probability and lower impact. Okay, so there's accept. There is a very popular, a very commonly used one, which is called mitigate. Mitigate means taking some action, doing something in advance of the risk actually occurring, which will lower the probability or the impact of the risk, and in theory, perhaps causing it to not happen. Or if it does happen, it will have less of an impact. This is a risk response strategy that is widely used and it's generally for risk scores that are higher in nature, that have a higher risk score. You would often use mitigate. Another risk response is avoid. Avoid is where you completely eliminate the possibility of the risk by removing the possibility of it ever occurring, by whatever conditions are causing that risk to occur, to remove them from the scope of the project. This is something that is not always possible to do, but if possible, it is done. It is reserved for those that are the really high risk scores. The fourth risk response is transfer, risk transfer. Now, this is something that, again, can't always be done, and involves transferring the impact of the risk to some other entity other than the project. Two common examples are insurance. If there is like insurance, the whole idea of insurance is that if something is a potential risk, a potential loss that could occur, you can insure that risk. You can work with an insurance company that if something happens, they will take on the loss or the impact. For example, if you have an apartment and you have possessions in your apartment, you can take out contents insurance of your apartment so that if there is a fire or a break-in or something like that, if you lose those possessions, the insurance company will, instead of you being impacted, the insurance company is impacted. They'll have to take the financial loss for that. So you're transferring the risk of that occurring to them. Now, they don't do it in the case of insurance. They don't do it just because they're want to be beneficial to you. There's a premium there. You have to pay money for that. So insurance is an example of the risk transfer, risk response. Another type of risk response is through perhaps the use of waivers. For example, if you were organizing a marathon or some kind of a sports event, you have the risk of people being injured or suffering a heart attack or something like that, which would be a financial loss potentially for the project. The risk of that can be transferred to the participant by having them sign a waiver. So risk transfer, though relatively rare, is useful in some instances. So that's the fourth risk response strategy. The fifth is called risk escalation. There are certain risks that are sort of beyond the scope of the project team and project manager. It's sort of beyond their pay grade. So in certain situations, there's risks that are escalated to those higher in the organization. That's called risk response. So overall, the most highly used risk response are accept and mitigate. The other three are less commonly used, but are nonetheless available. Any risk that remains after performing the risk response strategy is called residual risk. So as an example, just to use a few cases, for risk acceptance, if you accept the risk, then the residual risk is all of you haven't reduced the risk at all. So the residual risk equals the total risk that occurs. For risk mitigation, if you take a mitigation approach, then the residual risk is that risk which remains. is that by mitigation, you are lowering the probability, but not to zero. You are lowering the impact, but not to zero. So there is some reduced risk, which is the residual risk. For risk avoidance, for example, the residual risk would be zero. There is no risk because you have completely eliminated the risk. So those are some examples. Now, there's also actions to be taken if the risk actually occurs. So risk response is all the actions you take before the risk occurs, in preparation or in advance of the risk. However, there are situations where what happens if the risk still does occur? The actions to be taken if the risk occurs is called the contingency plan. It's your plan B. Okay, let's watch the video and we'll see how the project manager and team creates the risk response and contingency plans.
Sophie looks at the list of risks and prepares to address the project team.
I don't want any of these risks to occur during the project. So is there anything we can do now to make them less of an issue later on?
The team decides that no additional actions are needed for the low-priority risks. For the other risks, they make a list of additional actions they could perform that will help lessen the seriousness of the risks. For one risk, risk number 8, the translation of the promotional video to other languages, they decide that the risk of problems is too high, and they recommend that the requirement be removed from the project's scope. Another risk, risk number 3, is escalated to Arun for discussion with the senior management team. Next, the team considers each risk as well as what actions should be taken if the risk occurs and what would trigger these actions during the project. Sophie records the minutes of the meeting, ensuring that the activities discussed are accurately documented.
So as part of this process, Sophie adds to the risk register for each risk a complete description of the risk response plan for each risk. So which risk response strategy is selected, the details of how that would be carried out, as well as a complete description of the contingency plan for each risk, including the conditions that would cause the contingency plan to be triggered. So key idea, determine the risk response and contingency plan for each risk. Here are the key terms for the risk planning chapter. You can find this, of course, in the key terminology section, the references, and thanks for watching.